So this is just a presentation that I made for one of my first year writing courses that covers the anatomy of a position paper. So this is a specific kind of academic paper, but the general information here is broadly applicable. This is interpolated from a textbook called A Short Course on Writing by Ken Bruffy. I've used it in my first year writing classes for years. It's a great a way of, I think, learning kind of the larger discursive purposes of the different structural parts of academic essays. So this is the prompt that they're responding to. I don't necessarily think that you need this in order to understand what's ahead. But the idea here is that they're trying to convert something that they've written before. In this class, it was their WA1 from something like a personal essay into a position paper, a more academic paper. So in an academic paper, you essentially have, broadly speaking, three kinds of paragraphs. You have an introduction, you have support paragraphs, and you have a conclusion. And this slide here just lays out the purposes for each of those. So in the introduction, you're setting context, and you're also delivering your proposition or your thesis. In your support paragraphs, that's where you explore, explain, or defend the proposition. I think in a good paper, you're doing all three of those things. So, your exploration might be a literature review. Your explanation might be where you go over your methods, and your defense might be where you are looking at your results and drawing conclusions with your results. This is also in these middle parts of the paper where you want to establish your conversation with the other text that you've used in research. And then the conclusion broadens the context of the essay and invites response. So obviously we've already covered some of this. This breaks down and there are more kind of micro purposes that you can identify for different parts of the paper. But the main idea here is that when you're in support paragraph mode, you're in some way exploring, explaining, or defending. In this case, the proposition. In your case, it may be a thesis. These are things that an introduction can do. They don't have to do these things, but you can tell a story. You can highlight a key source. You can describe a problem. You can give some historical context for your subject or the problem. You can explain assumptions that you're working with in the paper. And you can define key terms. Good intros usually do more than one of these things. They usually use a combination of different moves lined up in a kind of sequential order. So start with a compelling anecdote that's related to your topic. Maybe you use that to establish some kind of emotional connection with your audience, an appeal to pathos. Then you describe a problem illustrated by that anecdote, give some historical context of the problem, summarize a key source that also examines the problem while laying out the key terms that you'll borrow from it, and then deliver a proposition or a thesis about how to approach the problem or how you will approach the problem in your paper. But really the only thing that an intro has to do is offer your thesis or your proposition, but a good intro will do much more than that. So in this case, we're looking at propositions. So if you're working in the humanities, if you're working in ELA, if you're working in maybe the social sciences in some context, philosophy, proposition-driven papers are really kind of vital. So in the short course book, Bruffy goes through a lot of lengths to kind of break down how propositions work. And this may be valuable to you if you're going to, be writing those kinds of papers. But even if you're not, it's, I think, beneficial to differentiate between a thesis statement and a proposition. So this is just an example I made up. So Krashen's reading hypothesis is a hypothesis that basically says that, one of the best ways to improve your writing is to read, and one of the best ways to improve your reading is to write. So I came up with using Krashen's hypothesis and a thorough literature review. This paper will explore the impact of reading practice on writing advancement and writing practice on reading advancement. This is a thesis because I'm describing to you what the paper will do. If I were writing a more proposition-driven paper, something that's maybe even more opinion-based or perspective-based, I could say something like crashing is right. Reading makes us better writers, and writing makes us better readers. The first one, you can't really argue with it, right? That's what the paper will do. The second one, you immediately could speak back in disagreement with this or agreement with it and start a conversation with me. So it's arguable. It's also short and concise, and it's loaded with words that we're going to use throughout the rest of the paper. So knowing your situation, knowing which is more appropriate for which situation, you're either going to write a thesis or a proposition. And looking at these two things next to one another kind of gives you an idea of the differences between the two, the purposes of each. So once you have the main idea of your paper or the purpose of your paper defined, then you want to start to think about how you're going to support the position you're taking or communicate the idea that you want to communicate. And that's your support paragraphs, everything that comes after the introduction and precedes the conclusion. But then again, we can break that down into smaller sections. So it depends again on the context of your writing. If you are writing a paper that is based on an experiment, you know that you're going to need a methods section. If you're writing a paper that is based on a lot of data collection, then you know you're going to need a section that covers how you collected the data and how you analyzed that data. If your topic is fraught with conflict and contradiction, then you're probably going to want a section of the paper where you go through the literature and the common kind of contradictions or thoughts in the topic area so that you can kind of demonstrate, one, your ethos. You've read and taken in and considered all this stuff. But two, it also helps you frame your purpose in writing too. So that could look like something like a literature review. A lot of times there's a part in technical papers that's called the discussion. You could use this also as a way of interfacing with your sources and kind of saying, well, based on the results that I got, based on this data that we collected, here's sort of what we can learn about the conversation with these other sources so far. But the basic idea is that everything that comes between the intro and the conclusion serves your proposition or your thesis in some way. It helps your audience understand what you've done, how you've done it, how you've analyzed the results of what you've done, and then what conclusions you're drawing from that. And interestingly enough, those conclusions don't always go in the conclusion of your paper. Likely that should be a section of the body of your paper because the conclusion does something completely different than summarize the paper, but we'll get to that in a moment. So another thing that comes from this is that Bruffy has this idea of narrative and reasoning conversation, which, these terms are, a little, I think, impenetrable out of context, but it's really not that complicated. So narrative conversation, that's the stuff that you're getting from your secondary sources or your primary research. Reasoning conversation is your analysis of how the narrative conversation helps you explore, explain, or defend the proposition. So a good way to illustrate that narrative to reasoning conversation would be, in Krashen's text, blah, 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 he says X, Y, and Z in quotes. And then after that, I might say, because we have learned this from this other source by so-and-so, we understand by synthesizing these two sources that we could say, A, B, or C about how Krashen's ideas fit into a more contemporary education context. So narrative conversation, that's where you deliver your research, whether it's quotes from secondary sources or information you've gathered from primary sources. And reasoning conversation is where you sort of explain why that's in the paper and what you want to do with it in terms of advancing your proposition or your thesis. A key part to pay attention to in the anatomy of any kind of academic paper are your transitions. So if you are working with a style guide that comes from a particular citation system or just something that a particular academic body, whether it be a journal or a conference, has decided is its preference, you really don't have to think too much about it, because generally those things are broken down into headed sections, which is something I would encourage you all to do anyway when you're writing any kind of paper, unless it's expressly forbidden by your style guide. And the reason for this is because it just makes it so much easier for you to signpost structure throughout. And it kind of does away with this idea of having to sort of do all these gymnastics between paragraphs to connect one point to another, but also connect those points back to your thesis or your proposition. However, that is what transition sentences between paragraphs should do. They signpost structure, meaning they help your reader understand the structure of the paper. They do that by reusing language from your thesis or your proposition. Usually, they're a sub-generalization of the proposition, and then they set up a subtopic for the support paragraph. So what that might look like, let's say you're just writing a 4-paragraph position paper. You're going to have 3 key generalizations in that paper. The first is going to be your proposition. The next 2 will be the first sentences of your 2 support paragraphs. And all of those sentences have to connect. If those sentences are connected by common language, then your reader will understand how each individual paragraph of the paper explores, explains, or defends your proposition. So my proposition here, dogs are great pets, but only if you're able to offer them the attention and companionship they require. So in my first transition here, I want to talk about why dogs need certain kinds of attention and companionship. So I said dogs are pack animals, and as such, they require their owner's attention and companionship in order to feel safe. So this is part of the case that I'm making here, that yeah, dogs are great pets, but you've got to be able to mimic that pack environment for them, or they might not be so comfortable and they might act up and do some things that you don't like. Transition 2, when I'm moving into my next paragraph, says when a lack of attention and companionship makes dogs feel unsafe, they may engage in destructive activities and frustrating behavior. So you can see the logical progression of ideas from the proposition to the 2 support paragraphs. If those 3 sentences were bolded in the paper, you could probably get the gist of the entire paper just from those 3 sentences. This really helps your readers keep track of your points. It's essential if you're not using headed sections. It may be essential within headed sections, and there, rather than necessarily going back to the thesis or the proposition, you might want to instead go back to the purpose of the section as defined by the header when you make that move. So once you have your proposition or your thesis, you've figured out how you want to explore, explain, or defend that proposition or thesis. You've laid out all of your research. You've connected your research to your proposition or thesis using your reasoning. You've written your paper, and now what you need to do is figure out how to conclude it. So here are some things that conclusions can do, and I can't stress this enough. They can summarize, but they should do more than just summarize. A conclusion of a paper is not the same as the conclusions that you draw from your research. It has a separate purpose, which is to be a call to action to your audience. Because academic discourse is discourse, you want people to use material from your paper and speak back to you, even if they're disagreeing with you, because it keeps you in the mix, it keeps you in the conversation, it exposes more people to your work, and it allows you to enter into an ongoing dialogue with other scholars in your field. So some ways that you can do this. So broaden the context of the essay, show how the thinking you've done in your essay may be applied to other problems, issues, fields, communities. So maybe I come up with a novel tool for helping folks who have mental health issues, and my paper is all about that. But in the end, I want to broaden the context to also talk about the role of mental health issues in homelessness, and talk about whether or not my tool could be valuable in doing social work with the homeless population in order to get them off the street and get them, rehabilitated and into society. You can also refine the proposition. So your thoughts are going to change as you go through your research and as you write the essay. And a lot of times when we're writing in school context, we have a deadline. So we think, oh, that's a disaster. But it's really not. All you have to do is address it in the conclusion. And if you do that, then it demonstrates to your reader that you're flexible in your thinking, and that flexibility has led you to some new value that you've uncovered. You can also evaluate your own work. You can explain what you see as being both strong and limited about your own argument or your own methods. So let's say you do an experiment and the scale of the experiment limits the data that you can collect. That's a great thing to talk about in your conclusion, because somebody else might have more resources, somebody else might have more data, somebody else might have a novel idea about a way to increase the sample size of your study. And then you've got a collaboration going and you can solve the problem that exists in your paper through that collaboration. You can also suggest other approaches. You can say, this is the way I did it, but you can do it a different way. So for instance, let's say I write a paper on a social issue that's largely driven through ethnography. I have interviewed people about their experiences, and using those interviews and the information that I've gathered from them, I'm trying to make a point about some kind of social problem and how it affects our communities. I could say, this is great for understanding people's experiences, but it's not so great for having data about how common these experiences are or what the outcomes of these experiences generally are. So I might suggest that somebody take up the mantle, or somebody give me some money so I can take up the mantle on that work and continue it. You can also speculate. You can go out on a limb and speculate. You can talk about the long-term implications of your argument. So a lot of you wrote papers about ethics papers having to do with some kind of technology during the third module. And if that's something that you're doing, then speculation is a great way to kind of open up your discussion for, more conversation. If you're thinking about AI specifically, and maybe you're thinking about autonomous weapon systems and the ethics of autonomous weapon systems, your conclusion could paint a picture of what you see the future being when these autonomous weapon systems are integrated into our military tech. Maybe that looks rosy and like they're being responsibly used. Maybe it looks like a dystopian hellscape. It's up to you and what you find in your research about the topic. So here's a step-by-step that I think is important, because a lot of us, I think we have to or should write our papers from beginning to end, from the intro to the conclusion. And Bruffy argues, and I would agree, that that's really not the best way to go about things, because how do you introduce a paper before you know what the paper is? I suppose you could just kind of write whatever there and write it under the understanding that I will have to go back and change it. I think it's more efficient just to start with the parts of the paper that you're sure about and then work backwards from there. So obviously you have to choose a topic. You've got to do your research. That's step one. Once you do your research, we have to do the thing we learned about from Harris, which is coming to terms with your text. Make sure you're doing a close reading, list out the key terms and arguments, and compile a set of excerpts that you may want to use as direct quotes or paraphrases in your paper. From there, you want to start with your proposition or your thesis. Okay, there's a note here about bifurcation. Not super important here. It's just something that Bruffy is kind of picky about. I don't care about it so much. You could. It decides on what you decide, or it depends on what you decide. But the proposition or thesis should be the first thing that you write. From there, you want to write out, if it's a short paper like the one we're talking about here, your transitions. Maybe you want to set up your headers. However you are going to break down the paper, define the structure of the body of the paper before you start to write the body of the paper. Then you want to flesh out your supports with materials from your sources and research, and you tying that back to your overall purpose in writing. And then you want to write your conclusion, because once you know what you've argued and how you've argued it, you should have a pretty good idea about how to broaden the context and invite response from your reader. And then last, you want to write your introduction. So once you know what the paper is, once you know what your conclusions you're drawing from your research and what research you're going to use, then you should have a clearer idea of how to introduce the paper, and you can backtrack all the way to the beginning and get that part knocked out. So that's the anatomy of a position paper. Or it could be of a research paper. It's really kind of a catch-all for any sort of academic paper. I'll pop this into Canvas if you want to download it, or just share it to your own files or whatever to have the next time you're asked to write this kind of paper. It could be handy in maybe filling in some of the gaps in your education on writing academic papers so far.